The Clock That Stopped at 11:17, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with an old grandfather clock that suddenly stops at exactly 11:17. While everyone dismisses it as a mechanical fault, Miss Marple notices one detail that suggests the clock may have witnessed something far more sinister. Before we uncover what happened at 11:17, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales.
Chapter 1. The Clock That Stopped at 11:17. Rain had been falling over St. Mary Mead since breakfast. Not heavily, nothing so dramatic. It simply came down with the stubborn persistence of a woman who had made up her mind and wasn't going to be argued with. By 4:30, the village lanes were shining black beneath the grey sky, and the windows of the houses had begun to glow with the warm yellow light of lamps and fires. Miss Marple sat beside her sitting-room window, knitting a pale blue sock while the rain tapped gently against the glass. There was something soothing about it, something almost respectable. At precisely 5 o'clock, the church clock struck. Miss Marple counted the chimes without looking up. She had always been rather good at counting things. People laughed about it. They shouldn't have. Numbers, like people, tended to reveal themselves when watched carefully. The telephone rang. Miss Marple put down her knitting and answered it on the 4th ring. It was Inspector Harris from the county police. His voice sounded unusually flat. He asked if she knew a family called Bellwood who lived at Ashcombe House just beyond the village. "Oh yes," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Edward Bellwood, his sister Clara, and their nephew Thomas. Why?" There was a brief silence. "Mr. Bellwood's dead." Miss Marple's expression changed. "How unfortunate. It appears he died some time last night. His nephew found him this morning in the library. We've got no obvious cause of death yet." "And why are you telling me?" "Because of the clock." Miss Marple looked towards the rain-streaked window. "The clock?" "The library clock stopped at 11:17. She said nothing. Inspector Harris continued, "The strange thing is, Mrs. Bellwood says she heard it strike 11 last night. Thomas says he was in the library at 11:30 and the clock was still running. We've checked it twice. It isn't broken." "How curious. There's more. The clock belonged to Mr. Bellwood's father. Nobody's allowed to touch it." Miss Marple slowly picked up her knitting again. "Then I think, Inspector, somebody has touched it." Ashcombe House stood at the end of a long gravel drive bordered by bare trees. By the time Miss Marple arrived, darkness had settled over the grounds. Inspector Harris met her at the front door, looking tired and rather irritated. He had the expression of a man who'd been presented with a problem and expected it to behave sensibly. It wasn't going to. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. A maid hurried through the hall carrying a tray, then vanished without a word. Inspector Harris led Miss Marple into the library. Edward Bellwood lay beside the writing desk. He was a large man in his late 60s, dressed in a dark dinner jacket. One hand rested near the fireplace. The other was closed tightly around something that had not yet been removed by the police. Miss Marple looked at him for several seconds. Then she looked at the clock. It was an impressive old thing. Tall, dark wood, brass pendulum. Its hands stood perfectly still at 11:17. Miss Marple walked closer. "Have you wound it?" "Yes." "And?" "It started." She glanced at him. "And then?" "It stopped again." "At 11:17?" "Exactly." Miss Marple leaned forward, but she didn't touch the clock. She studied the glass, the brass hands, and the small keyhole beneath the face. "Who found Mr. Bellwood?" "His nephew, Thomas." "And who was in the house last night?" "Thomas, his sister Clara, the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, and a family friend, Mr. Arthur Vale." Miss Marple looked towards the closed library door. "Where are they?" In the drawing-room. All four? Yes. Then we'd better speak to them. Thomas Bellwood was the first to enter. He was a nervous young man with wet hair and an expensive suit that seemed slightly too large for him. His hands were shaking. I found Uncle Edward this morning. He was already dead. Were you in the library last night? Asked Miss Marple. Yes, for a few minutes. What time? About 11:30. And the clock? Thomas swallowed. It was running. Miss Marple watched him carefully. You're quite certain? Yes. Then why did you tell Inspector Harris that you've heard it stop? Thomas stared at her. I didn't. From the doorway came a quiet voice. I did. Clara Bellwood stood there. She was a thin woman in her 50s, dressed in a dark green dress. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. I heard the clock stop, at 11:17. Inspector Harris frowned. You told me you heard it strike 11. I heard 11, then there was silence. Why didn't you mention that before? Clara looked at the body of her brother. Because I didn't think it mattered. Miss Marple gave her a small, thoughtful smile. Oh, I think it matters very much. There was a sound from the hall, a door closing. Everyone turned. Inspector Harris went to investigate, but Miss Marple remained beside the clock. She was looking at the floor. There, just beneath the clock cabinet, was a tiny pool of water, not rainwater. It had a faint brown color. Miss Marple bent closer. Something was lying inside it, a small brass key. She didn't touch it. Inspector, she said quietly. Harris returned. What is it? Miss Marple pointed towards the floor. He crouched down and stared. Then he looked at the clock. The winding key, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and I think somebody removed it deliberately. Harris straightened. But why? Miss Marple looked at the dead man, then at the clock, then at the people gathered silently in the doorway. Because, she said, someone wanted us to believe that 11:17 was the time of the murder. The room seemed suddenly colder. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere inside Ashcombe House, a floorboard creaked. Someone was still awake, someone who knew exactly what happened at 11:17.
Chapter 2. The Secret Behind 11:17. Inspector Harris shut the library door and turned towards the four people waiting in the drawing-room. The fire had burned low and rain tapped against the windows. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the hearth, her knitting resting in her lap. There's something about the clock that troubles me, she said. Thomas told us he saw it running at 11:30, yet we found it stopped at 11:17. Thomas shifted uneasily. My uncle was alive when I left. And you were arguing with him? Miss Marple asked. Yes. About his will? Thomas looked down. Yes. Clara watched him coldly. He threatened Edward. Thomas's face hardened. I was angry, that's all. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply watched his hands. There was a fresh scratch across one knuckle. Then she turned to Mrs. Finch. Did you hear anything last night? The housekeeper hesitated. Mr. Bellwood was arguing with someone. Inspector Harris looked up. Someone else? Yes, a man's voice. I couldn't hear the words. Miss Marple leaned forward. And the clock? Mrs. Finch swallowed. It struck 11. Then I heard a small click. After that, silence. Arthur Vale gave a quiet laugh. Old clocks make noises. Miss Marple looked at him. Indeed they do, but they don't usually stop at a useful moment. Arthur's smile vanished. Back in the library, Inspector Harris examined the clock again. Miss Marple noticed a tiny brass screw lying beneath it. Harris opened the back panel and frowned. Someone's been inside. Miss Marple nodded. Then 11:17 may have been arranged. Harris looked at her. You think someone stopped the clock deliberately? I think someone wanted us to believe that was the time of death. Miss Marple searched Edward Bellwood's desk. Beneath an account book she found an empty envelope marked, "For Clara only." Harris searched the desk and discovered a small locked compartment. The key found earlier opened it. Inside was an old photograph of Edward Bellwood, Clara, Arthur Vale, and a young woman whose face had been scratched away. On the back was a date, 14 October 1938. Beneath it were 2 words, 11:17. Clara saw the photograph and immediately went pale. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "In Edward's desk," Miss Marple replied. Clara stared at the damaged face. Her name was Eleanor Price. Inspector Harris stepped forward. "Who was she?" Clara lowered her voice. "She came here in 1938. She said Edward had stolen money and threatened to expose him." Arthur suddenly interrupted. "That's enough." Miss Marple turned towards him. "You knew her." He said nothing. That was when Miss Marple noticed mud on Arthur Vale's shoes. The same dark mud had been found on the bedroom carpet. "You haven't been upstairs?" she asked. Arthur stiffened. "No." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I didn't say you had." They searched the garden. Beneath a rose bush, the disturbed soil revealed a small metal box. Inside was an old silver watch. The initials EP were engraved on the back. The hands had stopped at 11:17. Inspector Harris stared at it. Eleanor Price. Miss Marple looked towards the dark house. "Yes, and someone buried this recently." A figure appeared behind them. Arthur Vale. Miss Marple looked from the key to his face. "Mr. Vale," she said quietly, "why did you stop the clock?" Arthur didn't answer. Then from inside Ashcombe House the great clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3. It stopped at 11:17. And this time someone screamed.
Chapter 3. The Truth at 11:17. The scream came from inside Ashcombe House. Inspector Harris rushed into the library with Miss Marple close behind. Clara Bellwood stood beside the clock, pale and trembling. The hands had stopped at 11:17 once again. On the floor lay an envelope bearing Edward Bellwood's handwriting. Inside was a letter revealing that Eleanor Price had never died in 1938. She had survived that terrible night and had recently returned to St. Mary Mead with evidence of an old crime. Arthur Vale finally admitted the truth. He and Edward had stolen money from a charity fund years ago. Eleanor had discovered them and threatened to expose everything. Arthur had confronted Edward on the night of his death, but he insisted that Edward was alive when he left the library. Miss Marple believed him. Then Clara confessed. She had found Edward alive after Arthur left. Terrified that the family's secret would be revealed, she had taken the letter from his desk and stopped the clock at 11:17. She hadn't killed him, but she had left him without help. Before Inspector Harris could take Clara away, someone knocked at the front door. A woman stood outside beneath a black umbrella. Miss Marple recognized her immediately. It was Eleanor Price. She had returned at last. "I didn't kill Edward," Eleanor said quietly. "I only wanted the truth." Miss Marple nodded. The mystery was finally clear. Arthur had created the old secret. Eleanor had returned with the evidence. Clara had tampered with the clock, and 11:17 had never been the true time of Edward's death. It had been a lie, designed to hide the truth. As Inspector Harris led Clara and Arthur away, Miss Marple looked once more at the silent clock. "People trust clocks far too much," she murmured. Then she picked up her knitting bag and walked home through the quiet village. If you enjoyed this mystery, subscribe to Haunting Vales for more original Miss Marple mysteries, hidden secrets, and classic British village murders. And leave a comment telling us what you thought really happened at 11:17. The rain had stopped. The village was quiet again. And this time, the clock kept ticking.